A freezing night, a German shepherd. Abandoned and left to die in the snow. His body was weak, his fur covered in ice. And his breath barely visible in the cold air. No one stopped, no one cared, but just when all hope seemed lost, something unbelievable happened. A man made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. But what happened next you won't believe it. Stay with us, because this story will shock you and warm your heart. At the same time, the wind howled through the empty streets, carrying sharp ice crystals that stung like needles. The temperature had dropped to a deadly low, turning the snow-covered roads into a silent frozen graveyard. In the middle of it all, a single figure lay motionless near the curb, a German shepherd, his once proud coat now matted with frost and dirt. His ribs protruded through his thin fur, his body weak from hunger. His breaths were slow, shallow puffs of steam against the bit-cold Rex had no strength left. His legs had given out hours ago, and his body was shutting down. He had fought to stay awake, to keep moving, but now the exhaustion was too much. His once sharp brown eyes fluttered shut. Footsteps crunched through the snow. Daniel Carter adjusted his worn-out coat, his boots sinking into the slush as he made his way home. It had been another long day at the auto shop, his hands stiff from working on engines in the inn. The cold, all he wanted was to get back to his cabin, throw some logs into the fireplace, and forget about the world. But something made him stop. A dark shape lay near the curb, barely visible against the snow. Daniel squinted. Was it just another pile of trash left behind? No, it was something else. His stomach tightened when he realized it was a dog. His first instinct was to keep walking. It wasn't his problem. Strays were common, and he had enough on his plate without taking in a half-dead dog. But then he saw it, a slow rise and fall of the dog's chest, barely moving, barely alive. Damn it, Daniel muttered. He crouched beside the animal, hesitating before reaching out. His gloved hand brushed against frozen, for the dog was ice cold. He wasn't sure if it was even worth trying then. Suddenly the dog let out a weak, shaky breath. Daniel let out a sigh. You're not dead yet, huh? Against his better judgment, he slipped his arms under the shepherd's limp body. The dog barely reacted, too far gone to resist. Daniel stood up, the weight of the animal pressing against his arms. He wasn't sure if the dog would even make it through the night, but leaving him out here meant certain death. With a grunt, Daniel started walking, snow crunched beneath his boots as he carried the dog toward his cabin on the outskirts of town. The walk was long, the cold biting at his exposed skin. As he stepped onto his porch, Daniel shifted the dog's weight, freeing one hand to unlock the door. The warmth inside hit him immediately, a stark contrast to the freezing night. He lowered the dog onto an old blanket by the fireplace, quickly tossing logs onto the flames to build the fire. The shepherd barely stirred. Daniel knelt beside him, shaking his head. Well, buddy, it's up to you now. Either you fight or you don't. Wake up. The dog didn't move. Daniel exhaled and rubbed his face. What the hell was he doing? He wasn't a vet, and he wasn't looking for a pet. This was just a stray, and tomorrow, if it survived, he'd figure out what to do with it. For now, all he could do was wait. The fire crackled, casting shadows along the walls. The dog's breathing was faint but steady. Maybe, just maybe, he had a chance. Daniel leaned back against the couch, exhausted. He wasn't sure why he'd stopped tonight, why he'd bothered saving this dog, but something told him this wasn't just a stray. This was the beginning of something he didn't see coming. The warmth of the fire flickered against the walls, casting long shadows across the cabin. The silence was broken only by the occasional pop of burning wood and the faint whistle of wind outside. Daniel sat on the floor beside the unconscious German shepherd, staring at the dog's frail body. The animal was barely breathing, his ribs rising and falling in shallow, uneven movements come. On Buddy, Daniel muttered, rubbing his tired eyes. You made it this far, don't give up now. Reaching for a dry towel, he started gently rubbing the dog's fur, trying to get some of the melted snow and ice off his body. The shepherd flinched slightly at the touch, but he was too weak to react further. Daniel sighed. The dog was still dangerously cold. He knew enough about hypothermia to recognize the signs. Shivering had stopped, breathing was slow, and the animal was completely unresponsive. He needed warmth fast. Standing up, Daniel grabbed an old blanket from the couch and wrapped it around the dog, tucking him in as if he were a sick child. He hesitated, then placed one of his heated work jackets over him, hoping it would help. As he stepped back, he felt a knot forming in his stomach. He had no idea if this was going to work. Daniel wasn't the kind of guy who took in strays. He lived alone in this cabin for a reason. No attachments, no complications. That was the way he liked it. So why had he stopped for this dog? He didn't know, but something about the way the shepherd had looked lying in the snow, helpless, abandoned, struck a nerve deep inside him. Daniel sat back down, watching the dog breathe. Minutes passed, then an hour, then movement. The shepherd twitched his front paw, shifting slightly beneath the blanket. A low whimper escaped his throat. Daniel straightened. Hey, he called softly. You awake? The dog didn't open his eyes, but his body shifted again, muscles tightening as if he were dreaming. It was a good sign. Daniel let out a breath. He hadn't realized he was holding maybe, just maybe, this dog would make it through the night. He stood and walked to the kitchen, grabbing an old bowl from the cabinet. He filled it with lukewarm water, careful not to make it too cold or too hot. Then he returned into the fireplace and placed the bowl next to the dog. Whenever you're ready, he murmured. The dog didn't move, but Daniel could tell his breathing had changed. Slightly deeper, steadier. That was enough. For now, exhausted, Daniel leaned back against the couch, his eyes growing heavy. The warmth of the fire, the quiet of the cabin, it was enough to make him drift off just for a moment. Then a noise, a weak, slow sound. Daniel's eyes snapped open. The shepherd was trying to lift his head. He barely managed it, his muscles trembling from exhaustion, but he was trying. His nose twitched and his dry tongue barely peeked out from his mouth. Daniel sat forward, heart pounding. The dog sniffed the air, his head tilting slightly toward the bowl of water. He was awake, barely, but awake. That's it, buddy, Daniel said quietly. Come on, you can do it. The shepherd's head wobbled, then dropped back down onto the blanket. His energy was spent, but the fact that he had tried it meant something. Daniel exhaled, running a hand through his hair. All right, he muttered, looks like you're not giving up after all. For the first time that night, a small smile tugged at the corner of Daniel's lips. This dog wasn't done fighting, and neither was he. The first rays of morning light crept through the window, casting a golden glow over the wooden floors of the cabin. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the air carried a comforting warmth. Daniel stirred on the couch, stretching out his stiff limbs. He hadn't meant to fall asleep, but exhaustion had won. He sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. Then he remembered. His gaze shot toward the fireplace. The German shepherd was still there, wrapped in the blanket, but something was different. His eyes, deep brown, sharp, despite the exhaustion, were open. Daniel froze. The dog was watching him for a long moment. Neither of them moved. The shepherd's ears twitched slightly, his body still weak but no longer completely lifeless. His nose quivered as he sniffed the air. You're awake, Daniel murmured, leaning forward slightly. He wasn't sure if the dog would try to get up or lash out, but the shepherd didn't move. He simply stared at Daniel, silent and wary. Daniel grabbed the bowl of water and slid it closer. You need to drink something. The dog's eyes flickered toward the ball. He hesitated, then, with slow trembling movements pushed himself up just enough. To reach it his tongue flicked out. Lapping at the water, Daniel exhaled. Relief washing over him. That's it, easy. Does it? The shepherd drank a few sips. Before his head dropped back onto the blanket, his energy spent, but his breathing was stronger now, less shallow. More controlled. Daniel sat back, running a hand through his head. He wasn't a dog person, hell he wasn't much of a people person either, but something about this animal, there was a quiet strength in his eyes, even in his weakened state. You've been through a lot, haven't you? He muttered. The shepherd didn't respond, of course, but Daniel could swear he saw something flicker in those brown eyes. Recognition. A soft knock at the door made Daniel tense. Who the hell was knocking this early? Pushing himself up, he strode toward the door and pulled it open. A small figure stood there, bundled up in a thick winter coat, her hat pulled low over her face. Lisa, Daniel's 10-year-old niece, looked up at him with tired eyes. She had only been staying with him for a few days, and she hadn't spoken much since arriving. After everything she had been through, he didn't blame her. Morning, kid, Daniel said, stepping aside. Come on in before you freeze. Lisa shuffled inside, rubbing her gloved hands together. Her eyes scanned the room, stopping when they landed on the blanket by the fire. Her eyebrows lifted. You got a dog? Daniel hesitated. Not exactly. Found him in the snow last night, barely alive. Lisa moved closer, standing a few feet away from the shepherd. The dog's ears twitched, but he remained still, watching her just as he had watched Daniel. Is he okay? She asked quietly. Don't know yet, Daniel admitted, but he made it through the night, so that's something. Lisa crouched down slowly, her movements careful. What his name? Daniel blinked. He doesn't have one. Lisa frowned, thinking. Then, after a long pause, she whispered, Rex. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Rex? She nodded. He looks like a Rex. Daniel glanced at the dog. The shepherd was still watching Lisa, his eyes calm but alert. He didn't flinch away from her presence. If anything, he seemed curious. Rex? Daniel exhaled. All right, kid. Rex it is. Lisa smiled just a little. It was the first real expression Daniel had seen from her since she'd arrived. Maybe, just maybe, this dog wasn't just here to be saved. Maybe he was here to save them too. The cabin had become unusually quiet. The morning light filtered through the frost-covered windows, casting a soft glow on the wooden floors. Rex lay curled up by the fireplace, his breathing steady but his body still weak from the night before. Lisa sat cross-legged a few feet away, watching him intently. She had barely spoken a word since naming him, but something about the dog seemed to hold her attention. Daniel, standing by the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee in hand, studied the scene. It had only been a few days since Lisa arrived, but this was the first time she looked engaged. She reached out slowly. Rex lifted his head slightly, watching her with sharp eyes. You sure that's a good idea? Daniel asked, raising an eyebrow. Lisa glanced at him. He won't hurt me. Daniel wasn't so sure. The dog had been through hell. Trust wasn't something that came easy. He understood that better than most, but as Lisa extended her small hand, Rex didn't flinch. Instead, he let out a deep, slow breath and nudged his nose against her fingers. A grin spread across Lisa's face. See, he likes me. Daniel smirked and took another sip of coffee. Guess he does. The moment was broken by a sudden knock at the door. Daniel's eyes narrowed. He wasn't expecting anyone. Lisa looked up. Rex, despite his exhaustion, stiffened slightly. His ears twitched. Daniel set his cup down and walked over to the door. He cracked it open just enough to see who was outside. Sheriff Tom Reynolds stood on the porch, his hat pulled low to shield his face from the cold wind. Morning, Carter, the sheriff greeted. His voice was friendly, but there was an edge to it. Morning, Tom, Daniel replied, stepping outside and pulling the door shut behind him. What's going on? The sheriff sighed, rubbing his gloved hands. Together heard you picked up a dog last night. Daniel's stomach tightened. Word travels fast. Small town. Tom said with a shrug. Look, I just wanted to check in. Someone called in about a missing German shepherd. Daniel's jaw clenched. Who? Tom hesitated. Mike Henderson. The name sent a chill down Daniel's spine. He knew Mike. Everyone in town did. The guy was bad news, always involved in shady business, and had a reputation for treating animals like disposable property. Daniel crossed his arms. And you think this dog is his? Tom shifted on his feet. Hard to say. He claims he had a shepherd and it ran off. Matches the description. Daniel's blood boiled. If this was Mike's dog, that meant one thing: he had abandoned Rex on purpose. That dog was freezing to death in the street. Daniel said, his voice low. If he belonged to Mike, why didn't he bother looking for him sooner? Tom exhaled. That's what I was thinking too. But legally, if he can prove ownership, there's not much I can do. Daniel clenched his fists. He's not getting him back. Tom studied him for a moment. Look, I just wanted to give you a heads up. If Mike comes knocking, be ready. Daniel's jaw tightened. I always am. Tom nodded, then tipped his hat. Take care, Carter. As the sheriff walked back to his truck, Daniel stayed on the porch, his mind racing. Mike Henderson, the last person who should own a dog. Daniel turned back toward the cabin. Inside, Rex lay still, his eyes half closed but alert. He might have been weak, but something about the way he held himself, something in the depths of his brown eyes, made Daniel realize one thing Rex remembered: and if Mike Henderson came looking for him, he wouldn't go without a fight. The air inside the cabin felt heavier than before. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, staring at his untouched cup of coffee, his mind replaying the sheriff's words. Mike Henderson, the name alone was enough to make his blood simmer. Daniel had never liked the guy. Too arrogant, too reckless, always treating others like they were beneath him. And now the thought of that bastard coming to reclaim Rex made Daniel's hands clench into fists. Lisa, sitting cross-legged on the floor next to Rex, glanced up. What wrong? Daniel exhaled sharply and shook his head. Nothing, kid, just thinking. She frowned but didn't push. Instead, she returned her attention to Rex gently, running her fingers through his thick for the shepherd had grown stronger in just a day, lifting his head more often, even shifting to sit up for short periods. He was still recovering, but the fire in his eyes had returned. A sudden bang on the door made them both jump. Rex's ears shot up. A deep, low growl rumbled from his chest. Lisa's eyes widened. Who is that? Daniel didn't answer. He already knew. He stood moving toward the door, heart pounding with frustration. He yanked it open, confirming his suspicion. Mike Henderson stood on the porch, arms crossed, his smirk as irritating as ever. Well, Carter, heard you got something that belongs to me. Daniel's grip tightened on the door. You mean the dog you left to die in the snow? Mike shrugged, completely unfazed. He ran off. Been looking for him. Daniel snapped. That dog wasn't lost. He was abandoned. Mike's smirk faded. Look, Carter, I don't got time for this. That's my dog. Trained him myself. You're going to give him back? Daniel's jaw tightened. Not happening. Mike took a step closer, lowering his voice. Listen, man, I ain't leaving without him. Either you hand him over now or I make this real difficult for you. Behind Daniel, a deep snarl erupted. Rex had pushed himself up, standing on shaky legs. His fur bristled, his ears flattened, and his teeth bared in a vicious display of pure rage. Mike's smirk returned, but there was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. Oh, now you remember me, huh, boy? He chuckled. Yeah, that's right, that's the fighter I trained. Daniel clenched his fists. You didn't train him, you broke him. Mike sneered. I made him strong. You made him scared. Daniel shot back, but not anymore. Mike took another step forward. Last chance, Carter, give me my dog. Daniel stepped in front of Rex, shielding him. Hugh, not yours anymore. Mike's face Darkened, we'll see about that. He turned and stormed off, his boots crunching in the snow. Daniel watched as he climbed into his truck and sped down the road. The tension in the air lingered. Lisa clutched Rex's fur. He's coming back, isn't? Daniel exhaled. Yeah. Rex let out a deep breath, his body still stiff, but there was something different in his posture. Something stronger. He wasn't afraid anymore, and neither was Daniel. The cabin was no longer just a place of warmth and shelter. It had become a battleground. Daniel paced the small living room, his mind racing. He had seen the look in Mike Henderson's eyes before, pure arrogance mixed with dangerous intent. The man wouldn't let this go. He would come back. Lisa sat quietly on the couch, her arms wrapped around her knees. She hadn't said much since Mike left, but her eyes kept darting toward Rex, who was now sitting up near the fireplace, ears perked, body tense. Daniel sighed and turned to her. Listen, kid, if he shows up again before he could finish, headlights swept across the window. Lisa's breath hitched. He's back. Daniel clenched his jaw. He strode toward the front door, taking a deep breath before yanking it open. Sure enough, Mike's truck was parked at the edge of the driveway, but this time he wasn't alone. Two other men stepped out with him. Daniel's muscles tensed. This wasn't a conversation anymore. This was a threat. Mike smirked, stuffing his hands into his jacket pockets. Told you I'd be back. Daniel's voice was steady. And I told you you're not getting the dog. One of the men, a thick-necked guy with a scar on his chin, stepped forward. We ain't asking inside. Lisa stood up, panic in her eyes. Daniel. Rex let out a low, menacing growl. Mike laughed. Look at that. Guess he still remembers who's in charge. Daniel took a step forward. You were never in charge of him, Mike, and you sure as hell aren't in charge here. Mike's smirk vanished. Last chance. Carter hand over the dog. Daniel stood his ground. No. Mike's goons moved first. One of them lunged toward the porch, but before he could even reach the steps, Rex exploded into motion. Despite his weakened state, the German Shepherd surged forward with a ferocity Daniel hadn't seen before. He launched himself off the porch, his powerful jaws snapping at the man's arm. The guy yelped and stumbled back, tripping in the snow. Mike cursed, damn it. He turned to the other man, grab him. The second guy made a move, but Daniel was faster, with years of hard labor behind him. Daniel had no problem throwing a punch. His fist connected with the man's jaw, sending him staggering back. Lisa screamed. Mike reached into his jacket. Daniel barely had time to react before he saw the gun, but before Mike could even lift it, Rex lunged. A vicious snarl tore through the cold night air as the Shepherd tackled Mike to the ground. The gun flew from his hands, landing somewhere in the snow. Mike let out a strangled yell, and Rex clamped his teeth onto his arm, his growls deep and full of years of pent-up rage. Call him off, Mike screamed. Daniel didn't move for the first time. Mike Henderson was afraid. Rex tightened his grip for just a second longer, just enough to send a message. Before finally letting go, Mike scrambled backward, cradling his arm. His goons, now pale-faced and shaken, helped him up. You're going to regret this, Carter. Mike spat. Daniel didn't even blink. Get off my property. Mike hesitated, then turned, stomping toward his truck. His men followed, throwing one last nervous glance at Rex before climbing in. The truck roared to life, tires spinning against the icy ground as they sped off. Silence fell over the cabin. Lisa let out a shaky breath. Daniel looked down at Rex. The dog stood tall, chest heaving, his brown eyes locked onto Daniel. No fear, no hesitation, just loyalty. Daniel knelt beside him, running a hand through his thick fur. Hell of a job, buddy. Rex let out a huff, his tail twitching slightly. Lisa wiped her eyes and smiled. I told you he wasn't scared of Mike. Daniel chuckled. Yeah, kid, you sure did. The battle was over, but their story wasn't. The cabin had never felt so Quiet the adrenaline from the fight had worn off, leaving behind only exhaustion and the distant hum of the wind outside. Daniel stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching the horizon where Mike Henderson's truck had disappeared. He had no doubt that the man would think twice before trying to take Rex again inside. Lisa sat on the floor beside Rex, running her fingers gently through his fur. The dog, though still recovering, seemed more alert than ever. His ears twitched at every sound, but his body was relaxed. He was home. Daniel stepped back inside, rubbing his stiff knuckles. You all right, kid? Lisa nodded. What about you? He smirked. I'll live. She smiled at that real smile, the kind he hadn't seen since she arrived. It was small, but it was there. Rex let out a long, deep breath and laid his head in Lisa's lap. She giggled, stroking his ears. I think he likes it here. Daniel exhaled, looking at the dog that had nearly died in the snow just days ago. He had intended to help him recover, then find him a proper home, but now Rex wasn't going anywhere. You're stuck with us, buddy, Daniel muttered, scratching the shepherd behind his ear. Rex let out a soft huff, his tail giving a lazy wag. Lisa beamed. He is staying. Daniel shrugged. Unless you want to send him back out there. Lisa shook her head fiercely. No way. Then I guess he's ours. The words felt strange but right. Rex had already proven himself more than once. He had stood his ground, protected his new family, and chosen to stay. Lisa wrapped her arms around the dog's neck. You hear that, Rex? You have a family now. The shepherd closed his eyes as if he understood. Daniel watched them, his heart lighter than it had been in a long time. For years he had kept his distance, choosing solitude over connection, but now, with his niece finding her place and a loyal dog watching over them, something inside him had changed. He wasn't alone anymore, and neither was Rex. The past was behind them, the future, it was theirs to build together. Rex was left to die in the freezing snow, but fate had other plans. Through courage, loyalty, and the kindness of one man, he found not just a second chance, but a family. This story proves that sometimes the ones we save end up saving us. If this story touched your heart, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and share it with someone who believes in second chances. Let's spread more stories of hope and resilience.